Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I am looking at UK politics, in particular Parliament, the structure and role of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Essentially this is a bit of an introduction to Parliament. This is my first video on it and I'm just looking at the key elements of the role. So the beginning part of it. There's going to be a whole series of other videos which are going to go into some of the nuances of Parliament in a bit more depth and some of the key arguments on it. On the A-level specification from Edexcel, component 2, part 2.1, it says the structure and role of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the bits it tells you need to know are the selection of the members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, including the different types of peers, so I'm going to go through all of that, the main functions of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the extent to which these functions are fulfilled. So I'm going to look at the key functions at the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and I'm going to do a little bit on how well they are fulfilled. Selection of the members of the House of Commons. Well, the House of Commons is democratically elected, and although it's the lower house, because of the fact it's the only democratically elected house, is the thing that gives it its kind of sovereignty, its greater significance and greater power. It's made of 650 members, or MPs. They are elected via first past the post in their various constituencies. Now, the constituencies are of roughly equal size in terms of the voting population within them. However, there are some fairly large discrepancies. Now, the most notable of these is if you take the two extremes. So if we look at the biggest one, that's the Isle of Wight, which has 110,000 voters, whilst the smallest is up in the Western Isles in Scotland, which has only 21,837 in the constituency of Helena and if I've said that right, which I probably haven't. But that is the smallest constituency. Now, there is obviously some fairly significant issues here in terms of representation with such a huge variation in terms of constituency size, which has impacts in terms of the ideas of all MPs equally representing about the same number of people and about everybody's vote counting fairly equally. Most MPs are members of political parties. There are some independents, but these are fairly few and far between. A notable example is Richard Taylor, who was elected to Wire Forest campaigning on hospital closures, and he got elected twice on the basis of that. Now, the party badge tends to, for most MPs, to be hugely significant. Now, it's not always the case that most constituencies really know who their MP is. There are obviously exceptions to that, and very good MPs who are well known in their community, and people will vote for them as an individual rather than vote on party lines. But generally speaking, people vote on party lines, and therefore they vote for whichever party it is they like and whoever happens to be the candidate in their constituency. How a party selects their candidate varies across the country and varies from party to party. It mainly involves a branch of the constituency party, though there are times where you talk of someone being parachuted in by central office because they really want to get that person into Parliament. Some parties, like the Labour Party, use things like all women shortlist to try and improve the representation in Parliament. MPs selected for either cabinet or cabinet roles are known as frontbenchers because they sit on the front benches, and the rest of the MPs who sit behind them are known as backbenchers. The Conservative Party had pledged back under May to reduce the number of MPs to 600 and equalise the size in terms of population of constituencies by 2020. This didn't happen, hasn't happened, largely because of all the other stuff that was going on with Brexit, and then the stuff that happened with COVID and the fact that May was replaced by Johnson. Selection of the members of the House of Lords. Well, this is slightly different because obviously the House of Lords is not elected. It's also bigger than the House of Commons. It has no upper limit, actually. The numbers at the moment is over 800. And this actually makes it the second biggest legislative body in the world after the biggest, only other bigger upper chamber is in China. So there's three major types of Lord. There's the Lords Spiritual, which are the archbishops and bishops from the Church of England. There are appointed life peers and there are hereditary peers. Now, steps have been made to get rid of hereditary peers, and a hereditary peer is when essentially a title runs through your family, is passed on from father to son through generations. Now, there has been moves to reduce that and control the numbers, but it hasn't been absolutely ended. And so there are 92 hereditary peers now, 2 of whom hold royal offices, 15 of whom are elected by the whole House, and then the rest of the 75 are elected by their fellow hereditary peers aligned in different parties or crossbench. A lot of the House of Lords are crossbench lords, which means that they don't belong to a particular party. Now, when the Labour Party did Lords reform, they kind of set in stone the balance between these different groups, because previously one of the problems had been was that almost all hereditary peers were Conservative, and therefore this was seen to give the Conservatives an unfair advantage. So now, when a hereditary peer dies, they are replaced following a vote using the AV method amongst the hereditary peers of that group that they belong to. So if a crossbench MP a crossbench hereditary lord dies, and they are going to be replaced by another hereditary crossbench MP. And so to try and keep the balance as is. Again, a lot of this in terms of the selection and membership of the House of Lords is far from ideal. Lots of people unhappy about the continued existence of hereditary peers, full stop. There's been lots of questions about appointment of life peers and why people get appointed. There's often there's been lots of scandals about those kind of appointments, and it tends to go to people who are close to the party in government. And then also some people object to the idea of Lord Spiritual and this connection between church and state. So a more complicated picture in the House of Lords. And one that definitely has its controversies. The main function then of the House of Commons, I'm going to look at a variety of these, and I'm starting with the idea of passing legislation. I'm going to do a similar thing then and go through the House of Lords. So most bills are initiated in the House of Commons by government. So they are government bills. They start in the House of Commons, and so they're actually started or initiated by the government, so the executive branch, rather than the legislature itself. So Parliament makes law, but Parliament as a whole doesn't necessarily generate it. It tends to be generated by the government. The distinction is difficult in the UK because we've got that fusing of power, that fusion between the executive and the legislature in terms of the Prime Minister and Cabinet sit inside the legislative branch. Most of the time government bills pass. In fact, it's big news when they don't, because a government tends to have a majority, and therefore they can tend to get things through. Therefore it's the first story on the 10 o'clock news and big news in all the newspapers and things like that if a government fails to get something through, because it generally means there's been a rebellion by some of its backbench MPs who have got together with the opposition and voted something down. Now, parties obviously want to avoid this, so a party in government will use its whip system. So these are a kind of a group of people, MPs, who are employed essentially to keep an eye on their fellow MPs and make sure that they vote as they should do. And they're given a variety of kind of powers and means to do this. And if they want MPs to vote a particular way and it's really, really important, then you get something known as a 3-line whip. And this is when a bill is essentially underlined 3 times, making it a 3-line whip. And essentially, if you don't vote with your party on a 3-line whip, then you're going to be in trouble. And you're going to face disciplinary action. This could include having the whip withdrawn and being suspended from the parliamentary party. Now, we saw this highly controversially with Boris Johnson suspending the whip of multiple Conservative MPs over them voting against the government on Brexit bills. We've also seen the removal of the whip by the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn surrounding the issue of anti-Semitism. Again, so another reason why a bill can be why the whip can be removed is for other disciplinary reasons. So when a vote on legislation takes place in the House of Commons, this is what happens is the Speaker calls what is known as a division. And on a division, the MPs leave the chamber and then they literally walk through one of 2 lobbies. If they agree with the bill becoming an act, then they walk through the aye lobby. If they disagree with it, then they right through the no lobby. and that is how our laws are made. So there's no secret ballot in terms of MP, so everybody knows how every MP has voted on every bill. Now, most of this stuff is government bills, but you can get private members' bills. This is when it is initiated in the legislature. Genuinely, it's a backbench MP who goes, I think we need a law on this, and as long as they get enough support amongst their fellow MPs, then they can promote that bill and get it passed. And one of the most recent examples of this was Chris Bryant, who got the Assault on Emergency Workers Act passed in 2018. So we can see this slightly different method of doing things. Another one of the main functions of the House of Commons is scrutiny of the executive. Now, the job of the opposition is to hold the government to account, and though Johnson seems rather put out during the COVID crisis when Starmer has been doing this, he seems to think he should be on board with him and backing him on absolutely everything, and looks a bit gone off at Prime Minister's Question Time when Starmer and others criticise him. And ministers must explain and defend their policies in Parliament. Almost all key ministers are in the Commons, so this mainly takes place in the House of Commons. So this can take place through questions to ministers, either oral or written questions. Most importantly, at Prime Minister's Question Time each Wednesday. Now, that's one of the bits where you'll see it's kind of that bit of political theatre where you see Starmer and Johnson, whoever's Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition at the time, kind of clashing over the events of the day. One of the big criticisms of it really is this doesn't look like proper serious scrutiny. This just looks like more point scoring and getting a positive mention in the newspaper the next day, and a good put down of the person stood next to you to get laughter from your half and damage their point. Probably more important scrutiny takes place in things like select committees. So select committees, committees of MP who look closely at the work of a particular department and can hold them to account on it. So there's a defence select committee, there's an education select committee, and so they will then often be made up of MPs with particular interest in that area, and they will hold that department to account, and they can interview ministers and ask questions and produce reports on the performance of those departments. The other way that scrutiny happens is through debate, and these can really shape events, especially if a government is defeated in a debate, or if there is a topic chosen by the Backbench Business Committee, which has since 2010 had control of debates in the House of Commons for 1 day a week. And this stuff all played quite a major role during the whole Brexit debates, where the backbenches took an unprecedented level of control in driving business and what was going to be discussed and setting the agenda. Now, in normal circumstances with the majority government, then the majority government will hold court most of the time. But what this does show is that the House of Commons does have a degree of power when it comes to having this idea of scrutiny and driving business and looking at what the executive is doing and trying to push the executive in certain directions. Another one of the key functions of the House of Commons is providing ministers. Almost all ministers sit in the House of Commons, and they must sit in either the House of Lords or the House of Commons. They have to be one or the other, but most are in the Commons. And the PM has power of patronage, so they get to decide who becomes a minister, and therefore things like your voting record and your loyalty to the Prime Minister can be really important. And the Whip's office can play a kind of important role in this in terms of making recommendations, which is one of the things that they can use when trying to twist the arm of an MP about whether they're going to support the government on something or support the opposition on something. In terms of going, well, we did kind of have our eye on you, and we thought we might be mentioning your name to the Prime Minister as the potential future minister of, and that kind of thing. Again, this idea of the Commons providing ministers, it does have some issues in terms of what you often end up with is people who are not experts on an area or particular expertise in an area controlling a ministry. Or department, and that can be far from ideal. So you're not necessarily getting an expert, you're getting a generalist who's been elected as an MP, and then through patronage reasons has been selected by the Prime Minister and put in charge of it. Another key element or function of the House of Commons is representing the will of the people. So they should be representing their electorate. Now, obviously, there's a direct link here because MPs are elected by the constituents and should really consider their views if they want to get re-elected. Many, as I said earlier, own their seat to the party badge and will tend to follow a partisan line on the idea that this is the manifesto ideas that they were elected on, and therefore that's what they're going to follow. Now, a delegate model, this idea of directly representing the people, is not often adopted in the UK, but it can be an issue when it comes to certain things. So, for example, over the whole Brexit debate, we had issues where the MPs' view on Brexit clashed with those of their constituents. So we had Remain MPs who represented strongly Leave constituents and vice versa. We've seen MPs voting against party lines on issues such as the extra runway at Heathrow and HS2 because of the impact it will have on their constituency if they're built. Now, another area of representation is how representative the House of Commons is of society. And generally speaking, in terms of issues such as race and sexual orientation, this has improved. And actually, the House of Commons is relatively representative. The one area really where it falls down is gender, and women are still massively underrepresented in the House of Commons. The main function of the House of Lords then, so again this starts in the same place, which is passing legislation. So Lords votes on legislation does not have the same power that the House of Commons does, because it can't block it, it can't stop it. It can hold it up for a year, but it can't completely make it go away. So yes, they play a role in passing legislation, but it's not as important role as the House of Commons. There's also other certain important rules, so they can't block a bill that comes from the government party manifesto. They can't block a finance bill. There are other bits which function a bit like the House of Commons. There is a whip. There are whips in the Lords, but not as many of them, and it's not as significant because you don't have, again, you don't have the government party and the opposition party in quite the same way in the House of Lords, particularly with a high number of crossbenchers. Votes take place following a speaker calling "clear the bar," which I've always thought was slightly amusing. And then the Lords divide, and again they go into two lobbies, and their lobbies are either content or not content, and therefore they demonstrate their vote. Another thing that, again, with this bit with the Lords passing legislation, is it's not necessarily the case that all of the Lords, or indeed a particularly high percentage of them, are there at any given moment in time. If there is a particularly important bill, then they are more likely to turn up, but it's not necessarily always the case. Just like in the House of Commons, another main function of the House of Lords is scrutiny of the executive. Again, we get questions to ministers, though these are normally junior ministers whose job it is to oversee the passage of bill through the House of Lords. Most of the major ministers sit in the House of Commons. There are committees, though it's slightly different to the select committees in the House of Commons. They tend to be topic based, so constitution, science and technology, all kinds of different things like that, rather than department based. Now, the debate in terms of scrutiny in the House of Lords is often of a really high quality, because you've got a better chance actually of having, I don't know, recently retired experts in different areas, and you've got people with expertise in many fields rather than the career politicians that you tend to have in the House of Commons. So the debate can be really good, but it's whether debate actually has any impact is more debatable, because the House of the Lords structurally just has very limited power. So as good as the debate could be, and as significant as the points they might make for or against the government bill, whether it has any impact it passing or not can be fairly limited. The one bit it can do is it can really highlight these things and be picked up by the people, in particular picked up by the media, and that then can maybe get some kind of momentum behind it that have more of an impact on ultimately what happens. Another main function is providing ministers, but that is not a common occurrence, as I've already mentioned. But it does happen. I mean, a couple of relatively recent examples. In 2008, Gordon Brown recalled Peter Mandelson from the European Commission, appointed him to the House of Lords, and then made him business secretary. And this was all in the aftermath of the financial crisis, to try and help sort that out, and getting some expertise and experience in there. Boris Johnson promoted Nicky Morgan to the House of Lords when she stood down from the House of Commons, so she could continue to serve as Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and she continued to serve as Secretary of State until February 2020. So it does happen where we have ministers from the House of Lords. I mean, you could argue in some ways it might be a better idea on some things. So again, one of the major criticisms of ministers from the House of Commons is that they are generalists. They're career politicians. They're not necessarily experts in defence or education or whatever else it is that they're put in charge. Now, you might have someone in the House of Lords in your party who is an expert, a renowned expert on that area, and so part of me thinks, well, if they'd make a better minister and they got a better understanding of it, why not? I mean, the key counter to the argument to that comes in about the democratic mandate. Again, the way that we run our cabinet is very different to how it's run in other countries, where essentially when the executive and legislature are separate, but in the UK they are fused. So that makes it slightly more complicated. So how good a job does Parliament do at fulfilling these roles? Well, there are some fairly significant issues, I think, with both. I mean, with the Commons, the party system limits the strength of scrutiny, and in the House of Commons, for example, at Prime Minister's Question Time, you can quite simply just see some tribal politics rather than some proper scrutiny of government going on. So and even if the scrutiny is brilliant and incisive at any moment in time, if the government have got a strong enough majority, it doesn't really matter. So they could be torn to pieces in Prime Minister's Question Time, or a minister could be torn to pieces by opposition over something else. But as long as the majority holds and it passes, then the piece of legislation still passes, and the scrutiny hasn't really done anything. As I've already said, cabinet ministers could have scant relevant experience of the areas they end up in control of, and that arguably can have very negative impact. And you can argue, however, despite all this, that the Brexit crisis and debates did lead to a kind of renaissance in the power of Parliament. This idea that it simply was a rubber stamp for the executive seemed to go down. Now, partly that was due to the circumstances with us having a minority government, but certainly we saw a hugely unusual number of debates, a hugely unusual number of defeats. Boris Johnson had a terrible run at the start of his time in office as Prime Minister, where bill after bill were just rejected by Parliament. So Parliament can have a real bit of strength, but some of that comes down to the arithmetic in the House of Commons. Now, the Lords, I think, again, there are definite issues. They're slightly different ones. I mean, the fact that it's unelected really diminishes its legitimacy. It can offer expert opinion. It can raise public awareness of concerns over government action, but really most people would agree that the further reform is needed. It can't really do anything on very important issues, and it can only delay things on certain bills. And so there seems to be those expertise and things there. Whether it's been properly used and whether the format works is maybe an area of key debate. Again, it might not be necessarily something you agree with. You might be completely happy with the Lords as it is. Overall, most legislation, whether you like it or dislike it, is fairly soundly written and can be enacted. Examples of really bad rushed legislation are fairly rare. One of the most given examples was the Dangerous Dog Act, because it concentrated on breeds of dog rather than on irresponsible owners, and then the RSPCA and various other people have done surveys into it afterwards, and almost all the attacks by dogs after it were done by dogs that weren't on the list. And so there's dogs that, yeah, so it didn't work, but it was just the government responding to a load of stuff there'd been a series of dog attacks. There was a load of stuff in the press, and the government seemed to say, well, we need to be seen to act, and so they acted, and they acted in haste, and therefore the legislation wasn't very well thought through. Generally speaking, Parliament manages to produce some pretty decent pieces of legislation. I hope all of that has been helpful to you. If it has been, please hit the like. I'm going to continue making videos going through the rest of component 2. I'm also well through component 3 already, and component 1 is done. So there should be loads and loads of stuff on my A-level politics playlist and on the various other sub playlists on that can help you if you're doing A-level politics, or if you're just interested in UK and US politics. There's also a whole series of playlists looking at different aspects and different periods and different countries' history. So hopefully some of those will grab your interest as well. If you have not subscribed already, then please do, and you'll get notifications as I add more and more videos to my different playlists. Thank you very much for watching.